I don't think so. There's a little button on the base.
How about this? Good afternoon. Thank you for returning for the final session. It's a great honor to be a part of this conference. I've learned a great deal, and actually I'm going to attempt to reckon slightly with what's been discussed in the conference so far. Two quick caveats. I am presenting on one kind of Picasso to be found in the Middle East. I would reckon that there are at least 5 different formations of Picasso, and I'd be happy to talk about any of the other ones in the Q&A. And the other note to make is that there are 2 instances in this presentation where artists in the Arab world are responding to what seemed to be a very specific work by Picasso that I have, in each case, haven't found the precise work. So there's a lot that I could gain from specialists that might be able to help me identify these pieces. I present to you a Picasso drawing, a sketch of a beach populated by the kind of surrealist double imagery that had fascinated the artist in July 1933 during a summer in the French Riviera. We see 2 entities constructed from reticulated odds and ends, occupying the positions where bathers might otherwise go. On the left, a figure made of crumpled flags and twigs tied to a post, and on the right, a classical ruin festooned with twine and more crumpled bits that twist in the wind. The perverse quality of this drawing matches others in the 1933 series, an erotic charge of chance encounter, soured by the abject quality of these things, these crumpled things. Some critics discern a testimony to Picasso's unraveling marriage and a premonition of a wrecked home, but equally, this is the series. But equally, the use of codes and emblems testify to impending wars of civilizational destruction. Notice, for instance, the cluster of circles on the square flag on the left-hand post. These seem to riff on the haunting geometries of the peace emblem that artist Nicholas Roerisch proposed in 1931 to mark items of world heritage as neutral cultural artifacts in ways that might safeguard them from attack. Of course, this drawing is not a Picasso in the sense of being an autographic product. Many of you surely noticed how the hatching looked a little bit off, or the cloud was a little ill-formed. This is an illustration of a Picasso drawing that a young Iraqi artist and critic, Jamil Hammoudi, made in Baghdad in February 1944, the very height of the Second World War, when he circulated it to colleagues as an example of a surrealist image. Hammoudi was just 20 years old. He was engaged in Baghdad's vibrant cafe scene, self-fashioning as an impresario promoting the arts of the age in magazines and gatherings. The kingdom of Iraq in which they labored was in limbo, ostensibly sovereign but controlled by the British military. It served as a military base for Allied forces on the Near Eastern Front. Hammoudi's generation was acutely aware of the paradox of their unfree status in a so-called free zone. Several, including Iraq's most famous modernist, Jawad Salim, had actually been studying in Rome in 1939, and so witnessed the start of the authoritarian term. Moreover, wartime Baghdad itself offered refuge to modernists from elsewhere, including English surrealists recruited into the military, into the army, and Polish Kappists who'd enrolled in active service and escaped through Iran and then came to be stationed in Baghdad. Out of the polyphonic debate in the capital, Hammoudi came to favor a capacious and emotive surrealism, one that claimed Picasso and Henry Moore, and one that seemed to promise a means to overcome the constraints of old regimes. After making this drawing, which he labels an image of Zephyr by the great artist Picasso, he used it as an illustration to a translation of an English essay about surrealist artists that he took from the pages of Lilliput, a cultural magazine published in the UK, favored by Allied soldiers. I open with this instance of Arab response to Picasso because it seems to me to be an instance of a gap between the great artist of the 20th century, this is how Hamoudi spoke of Picasso, and an Iraqi unknown that fosters a kind of intimacy as much as it reifies distances of time, space, fame, and standing or skill. Hamoudi's circle accessed Picasso through his evocation of the artist's work, which appeared in handwritten magazines, they didn't have a printing press, that they made, compiled, and passed to one another, engaging it from a position well outside the famed empty homogeneous time of print capitalism. And as I'd like to explore in this paper, many artists in Hamoudi's generation, a cohort of Arab artists who came of age during the interwar years of foreign mandate rule, related to Picasso and to his fame as a site of possibility for co-production and even solidarity. And specifically, I'm going to say they saw Picasso as a producer of a metaphysical art, attesting to meanings behind appearances. And attesting to meanings behind appearances because art was understood to trace and otherwise capture the movement of insights and intuitions, bringing them into material and letting them go back out again. So to look at these artists' sense of affinity with Picasso is to recognize the robust worldliness of modernist practice in the Arab world. But it is also, I submit for the purpose of this conference, a reminder of the crucial unresolved quality of Picasso's legacy in the 1940s. When Hamoudi made his drawing, Picasso, this is February 1944, Picasso's lying low in Vichy, Paris, keeping shelter from the bonfire of degenerate art in Nazi Germany. American publications such as Vogue are amplifying his celebrity as a mythic liberated artist, speculating on his activities, but the jingoistic right-wing press in Paris, as Michel Cohn and others have tracked, were disparaging him as a foreigner, practicing a foreign art of strange geometries and simplifications. With the liberation of Paris that August, Picasso was restored to public visibility, including to the center of School of Paris prestige. But the next step was hardly assured for him. He shocked some onlookers by joining the Communist Party, that's been a recurring theme of this conference, embracing it as a platform for keeping alive the home of an attitude of collective resistance to fascism, so party as an actual home to exist within when other places are threatening. Nor was his greatness necessarily secured. When he exhibited in London in 1945, for instance, he met with outcry against the purported deformations of his wartime art. Just as a quick reminder, sorry for the map, but in what follows, I elaborate on the metaphysical readings of Picasso and Picasso-like arts that developed in the Arab territories of the Eastern Mediterranean, in French called the Levant. We don't have a good term for it in English. Mashriq, highlighting additional examples from the wartime 1940s. War in this region did not end with the liberation. Instead, in Syria, for instance, the very same Free French that defended the liberal cause in Paris turned on their colonial holdings, in 1945, bombing the cities in an effort to retain military control. Arab modernist deployments of the Picasso example, in other words, must be situated in a 20th century defined by the colonial incursion, neo-colonial economic grabs, and decolonization struggle. Let's go to Damascus, Syria, to look over the shoulder of a second intellectual engaged in reading Picasso. The date is now October 5, 1947. A young writer named Sidki Ismail sits in a bar, that's him in the center, and he's writing to a friend to share his evolving insight into the nature of imagination and creativity. Sidki was born the same year as Hamoudi, the first artist I mentioned, and so is now 23 years old. It may seem peculiar that he is writing to share thoughts about modernist art developments and imagination in a note that he's sending to a friend. But Sidki is a leader in the cultural office of the Arab Renaissance Party, El Ba'ath, the Ba'ath Party, a political movement emphasizing youth and prophetic promises of revived Arab flourishing. He tended to compose his letters with the expectation that they would circulate to other members as a round-robin communication. Syria had been recognized as a sovereign nation for only a year and was still rebuilding itself in its own name. Sidki's interest in modernist arts, fittingly, focuses on the elements that can be said to endure and to outlast the incidental. And as he writes in his letter, he had recently drawn just such a lesson by closely studying a recent Picasso painting, which he identifies as Woman and Cat, alongside his brother. Sidki writes, "My brother Edhem meditated on it for 2 continuous hours, dazzled by its color harmonies and its flow of lines. Many who saw it rejected it. I believe that many in Europe itself are among those who reject and disavow it. But it is eternal. The color red, tinged with black in the tail of the woman, the white dancing in green upon the chest, and the arrangement of 3 eyes in the face. It's a marvelous upspring from the sparks of the imagination. It is creativity and creation. How so, I do not know. Does Picasso himself know that the source is the omnipotent God, the imagination, the free element in man?" In this account, Picasso's art is eternal, not because he is a singular creator, but rather because he so adeptly responds to upsprings of energy from a world comprising greater gods and powers. Issued from within a Syrian struggle for sovereignty, this reading of Picasso is particularly interesting for its proclamation of the interconnectedness of the fates of arts, artists, and other beings in the world. It is, of course, reliant on the fact that Picasso is a celebrity for it to make any sense, but at the same time, it withholds recognition of the ego as a central agent of art. Instead, Sidki flips the myth of the artist as a godlike creator of an imaginary world and identifies a worlded imagination as the godlike creator of both Picasso and his art. There's a second way to look over the shoulder of Syrian avant-gardes as they accessed Picasso. In 1948, Edhem Ismail made his own drawing copy of a Picasso. Here, the subject of the sketch is not Picasso so much, I suggest, as a meditation on possible kinds of abstraction achieved by the artist in relation to these underlying forces. See how Edhem employs many of the same facial elements as Picasso, the same configuration of eyes, nose, and lips, the same ambiguous internal relationship between facial profile and full-face rendering, and relative configuration of eyes, nose, and lips. But here he forms them from red and green tracery, or an arabesque, producing a vector-like arrangement of line that hovers within a pearlescent space of streaked gouache pink, hinting at shell and at breast, but resolving as neither. This woman ultimately exists of no material, and instead movement and change. No delimited body, instead curtains that are fluttering in the breeze. Gone even is the impasto body of the original oil paint in Picasso's version. We don't have a body here. The non-body is placed atop a gridded plane of reds and mauves, the same colors as the dress of the woman that's been identified as Dora Maar, but now made into a cartoonishly flat surface design, a grid. Insofar as this sketch explores ways to index movement, it echoes Hamoudi's rendering of Picasso's so-called surrealist mode. Both are using tensile surfaces, flags, papers, skirts, to register the lift of a wind as a transforming force. One of the better ways to access Arab modernist intellectual history that underpins this affinity with a metaphysical Picasso, if we can see him that way, is to look to the cultural theory of academics in Cairo, which was then the publishing and market center of the Arab world. Cairo, too, had played host to large numbers of Allied soldiers during a war that did not directly concern it. But it also boasted a much larger elite cosmopolitan class that spoke French than the other countries, in part due to the free trade economy of the Suez Canal. And with it, then, boasted an avant-garde interested in literatures of magic, surrealism, and folk religions. And the connection between Egypt and the Parisian surrealists as they move into their ethnographic mode has begun to be tracked recently. In this milieu, scholar Bisher Ferris pursued an antiquarian inquiry into the question of Arab metaphysics and the fate of images within it. Publishing commentary on actual historical objects, here a 13th century illustrated copy of the Book of Songs he'd discovered in the Egyptian National Library, he developed a theory of Arab painting based primarily on an atomistic metaphysics, meaning a model of the world that is remade from moment to moment, such that God alone retains the status as a sole creator. So not a continuous history, but an atomistic one. And crucially, for my analysis today, our scholar Ferris attributes this notion of absolute recreation not just to Muslims, but also to the most creative of the modern painters in Paris, the symbolist Gustave Moreau, Maurice de Vlaminck, which is a bizarre one given his strange status as a possible collaborator during the Second World War, the Parisian surrealists, and Picasso. All of them, he writes in 1948, can be seen to respond to an urge to recreate a new world and to thereby make work testifying to its plenitude. Crucially, notice, this testimony does not emphasize visual pleasure. Entirely to the contrary, individual instances of art in this mode always appear distorted and anti-naturalistic. And for Ferris, this is because it's a modern art that is without ego, that instead emerges from breath and essence, and as such, its ugliness works as an affirmation of truth lying beyond sight. In other words, what I'm trying to highlight here is how a new generation of activists and theorists recognize that artists in the world, whether they are Picasso or medieval painters, work without guarantee of material endurance for their work. This worldview in part reflects a post-war recognition of nuclear instability. After 1945, war is waged with liquidating bombs and contamination and melt. A little emblem to preserve heritage is utterly powerless to this idea of destruction. But further, and in terms of readings of Picasso in particular, I think it expresses the possibility that such instability can produce kindred solidarity. Arab artists knew that Picasso was maligned by the authoritarian powers. They were reading the art magazines. They also knew that purported liberals were panicking in the face of his work. This is an example of the pre-war moment when Picasso is entered into the history and awareness of the Arab avant-gardes as an anti-fascist figure. Recall that Sidki remarks to his friend that even so-called civilized Europeans had recently rejected and disavowed Picasso's wartime paintings. This publication I've tracked, and it was actually present in Damascus, so they most likely were reading coverage in the studio and the sketch. And so they saw how Picasso's recognized leadership in the modernist effort to liberate art from the hold of the natural world had not protected him from attacks on his morals. They knew that in London, supporters of Picasso had countered these criticisms by praising the emotional realism of the work as an expression of wartime crisis in its fully psychological ugliness. But avant-gardes in Baghdad and Damascus tended to stress the obverse. They suggested that the value of these paintings resides in their push beyond fleeting psychological states to reach a testimony of form, the dance of a line on the chest. Theirs is a formalism based upon desire for shared metaphysical insights, not autonomy or flat competency. Earlier, I had shared Sidki Ismail's praise for Picasso's ability to deliver an enduring form in his artwork, an achievement that may seem at odds with the world of endless reconfiguration that Ferris identified as a modern sensibility underpinning Arab arts. And that is at odds, and this is, I propose, the fundamental tension in Arabic critical writing in the post-war period, as well as a lot of the French critical writing in the Arab countries on art of this period, which tends to engage with form as a kind of trace within a plane of perception that can always take other forms if sliced in other ways. All right. So in this regard, paying attention to the recurrence of a Picasso effect in the modernist abstractions of even the most nationalistic art programs can help to reveal an oscillating and potentially destabilizing play of the immaterial and the material. I have one more page to go. So as a final example, consider the oeuvre of Iraqi sculptor and painter Jawad Salim, a colleague of Hamoudi's, an alumnus of art schools in France, Italy, and England, and a creative organizer who launched the Baghdad Group for Modern Art in 1951, a loose collective of artists seeking to cultivate a multifold new art for Iraq. During the years 1944 to 45, he worked in the Colonial Antiquities Service, there resurrecting the sculptural language of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations and developing his sense of their application in new arts of contemporary progress. Here, literally images of building. For Salim, artistic forms and formats presented crucial problems of scale of audience, such that a desire for popular address had to be pursued in different ways in different arts. So a symphony reaches hundreds at once, a painting reaches 10. In general, it is the paintings that Salim made in the 1950s that we most closely associate with the influence of Picasso now. Scenes of daily life in Baghdad, they render characters and animals with these lively schematic marks, reminiscent of Picasso, but then placed in a horizontal space reminiscent of a Mesopotamian frieze. Picasso does take pride of place in Salim's own declarations of intent. The manifesto of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, issued in 1951, names Picasso as a premier artist of his age, whose willingness to freely combine insights from primitive Iberian art, African art, and Cézanne, among others, allow him to forge Cubism. For the Iraqi artists, Picasso's record of borrowing establishes an alibi for their own search for an authentic art based on a full array of modernist practices. But that's not the only way to read Picasso in their oeuvre. I want to now highlight a metaphysical Picasso who persists as crucial to these artworks. Consider Salim's sculpture, Mother and Child, a work in wood and metal consisting of two movable abstracted figures that can be placed in varying relationships to one another. It is, of course, a work with many art historical intertexts. I see Miro, I see Calder, I see Giacobetti, maybe even Oscar Schlemmer. But chief among his references is, of course, Picasso's bull's head sculpture, which we can view in the museum right now, made from a bicycle seat and a pair of handlebars and cast in bronze. In Salim's far more elaborate and articulated piece, it is the curve of the arms on both child and mother that echoes that of Picasso's bars. And in fact, it's really interesting to see Picasso play with that curve in the prints that we could also see up in the museum. Okay, final conclusion. As with Picasso, so too Salim. The artist tests an idea across multiple media. In the case of Salim, contemporaries responded to this quality by identifying the medium of his piece not as wood or metal, but rather as space in its cosmic dimensions. Not only did the components of the work occupy physical space, but they also radiated emotional presence in touch and maternal mercy. Further, fellow Baghdad artist Shakir Hassan el-Said describes the sculpture as a kind of musical rhythm, seeing Salim's use of vertical staffs in his construction of the mother as a pluckable instrument that can be played. The point is that in all of these so-called abstract works, the process of abstraction in no way entails a rejection of worldly content. Instead, it turns that worldly content inside out, so that artworks are said to disclose a world pre-existing and long surviving any of its singular entries, whether art, artist, or home territory of origin. So this conference, dedicated to two terms, Picasso and history, has invited us to reflect on our very model of history, how it moves and how it is perceived. In the opening keynote by Pepe Carmel, we confronted possibilities of multiple temporalities. The milliner's shop, a view onto a split in world economic history, so it gives a sort of accurate depiction of one kind of economy, but not others, as well as points of affective kinship, letters from the front, one from 1947, one from earlier, but bringing us into some kind of point of convergence. A colonial history of the kind I just presented, very quickly here, begins from a sense of break in the fabric of temporality. And the post-war insistence on a year zero is then doubly vexed in this situation. It's not just that the bomb destroyed models of progressive movement. It's the sense that a community is needed in order to enter time. So Syrians needed a Syrian nation in order to establish a state, in order to be allowed into the next threshold for future movement. An alternative to that idea was the political party. You can band together on other terms, claim a point of beginning. And a third possibility is actually the possibility of a refugee who is cast out of these systems, sort of stripped of an identity, and left, as Hannah Arendt says, as another vanguard, our vanguard. What I've been trying to suggest is that the Arab artist thought of Picasso, because of his foreigner status and his sort of abject vulnerability during the war years, as a fellow refugee who could be banded together with in order to rethink the status of the world and what art might reveal about it. And to gather together first in that way is to be political. And from that being together in a political sense, to make an art that is of and about a world that's going to outlast the self. So thank you very much.